I'm 80 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that providing was the same thing as loving. I know a lot of men were taught the same thing. That's the story I told myself. That's the story other people seemed comfortable believing too. I worked. I paid the bills. I made sure there was food in the house and a roof that didn't leak. I didn't disappear. I didn't walk away. I stayed. For a long time, I thought that was the promise. If you stayed and you carried the weight, you were doing your part. I thought staying was the proof. What I didn't understand back then is that staying can still mean being absent. I come from a world where a man was measured by what he could hold together, not by what he could say, not by what he could admit. Where I grew up, you didn't talk much about feelings. You handled things. You fixed what broke. You kept moving. I learned early that usefulness earned respect, and respect felt close enough to love that I stopped asking for more. I didn't know what more even looked like. I married young, not rushed, but young enough to believe that consistency would cover whatever I didn't know how to express. My wife used to say I was dependable. She said it like it mattered, and I held on to that word longer than I should have. Dependable felt solid. Dependable felt safe. Dependable didn't require vulnerability. I don't remember many big fights. That's something I used to be proud of. We didn't yell much. We didn't throw things. We didn't threaten to leave. From the outside, it looked steady, strong, the kind of marriage people assume will last. Inside, things were quieter than I realized. I worked long hours, not because I loved the work, but because it gave me a role I understood. When you're providing, there's always something clear to do next. Another shift, another check, another problem you can solve without having to explain yourself. At home, things were less clear, less measurable. My wife would talk about her day, about small frustrations, about things that didn't have a solution. I listened, but I was always listening with an exit in mind, a fix, a conclusion. If there wasn't one, I got uncomfortable. I didn't know why at the time. I didn't know how to sit with things I couldn't repair. That scared me more than I admitted. So I did what I knew. I made sure the lights stayed on. I made sure the fridge stayed full. I told myself that mattered more. I told myself that was love. There were moments when she wanted something else from me. Not help, not advice, just presence. Just me, without a solution. I didn't have a name for that then. I just felt like I was failing at something I'd never been taught. So I leaned harder into what I could do, what I could control. Providing became my language, the only one I felt fluent in. When the kids came, that pattern got stronger. Everything felt heavier, more urgent. There was always another expense, another responsibility, another reason to stay focused on survival instead of connection. I told myself this was the season for sacrifice, that closeness could wait, that love would understand. I believed there would be a later version of life, where things slowed down and we would catch up to each other, where all of this would make sense. That belief kept me steady for decades. It also kept me distant. I was tired most of the time, not just physically. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from holding everything together without ever putting it down, without ever asking what it's costing. But I didn't complain. Complaining felt ungrateful. Men like me weren't raised to complain. We were raised to endure, to carry things quietly. My wife noticed things I didn't, Or maybe she noticed them earlier. She'd ask questions that didn't have an easy answer. About us, about distance. I usually responded by doing more. Working more. Handling more. I thought effort could replace intimacy. I thought results could stand in for presence. I see now how unfair that was to both of us. At the time, I truly believed I was doing right by her, by the family. I wasn't cruel. I wasn't careless. I was limited. And limitation can look like neglect when it lasts long enough. There were stretches where we lived more like partners in logistics than partners in life. Schedules, responsibilities, routines. We were good at running things, not as good at sitting still together. I assumed this was normal, that this was what long marriages turned into. Quiet, efficient, distant. I didn't ask older men questions like that. You didn't ask questions that might crack the foundation you were standing on. So I stayed quiet, and silence became part of the structure. Years passed without anything dramatic forcing change. No explosion, no breaking point. That's what makes it dangerous. When nothing collapses, you assume nothing is wrong. I don't remember the exact moment I realized something was off. It wasn't a conversation. It was more like a shift. The way silence felt heavier. The way laughter showed up less often and left faster. Still, I didn't panic. Panic felt irresponsible. I kept telling myself the same thing. This is just how it is right now. Right now stretched longer than I expected. Longer than it should have. My wife got sick later in life. Not suddenly, not dramatically. Slow enough that we adjusted without realizing how much was changing, how much was being lost quietly. I took care of what needed taking care of. Appointments, medication, bills. I was good at that. I knew that role. People told me I was strong, that I was holding up well. I accepted that praise without questioning it, because it sounded familiar. Strength, again, felt close enough to love. What I didn't understand is that caregiving can hide distance if you're not careful. It gives you tasks. It gives you purpose. It doesn't automatically give you closeness. It doesn't give you back what was missing. There were nights when she looked at me like she wanted to say something, and I was afraid of what I wouldn't know how to answer. So I talked about practical things, tomorrow, plans, what needed to be done. I told myself I was protecting both of us, from fear, from pain. Looking back, I can see how often protection became avoidance. When she died, it wasn't a moment that taught me everything all at once. It didn't come with clarity. It came with quiet, a kind of quiet I had never lived inside before. The house didn't feel empty in a dramatic way. It felt unfinished, like a conversation paused in the middle of a sentence, one I never finished. For a long time after, I kept doing what I had always done, handled things, managed details. Grief doesn't always look like falling apart. Sometimes it looks like continuing out of habit. It was only later, much later, that the real weight showed itself. Not in the loss itself, but in what the loss revealed. I began to understand that I had spent my life preparing for emergencies, but not for stillness, not for being there. When the role of provider finally loosened its grip, I didn't know who I was without it. There were no more problems that could be solved by effort alone. No paycheck that could stand in for presence. That's when the questions started forming, slowly, uncomfortably. If providing wasn't enough, what had I actually given? That question didn't arrive all at once. It crept in during ordinary moments, moments no one warns you about. Standing in the kitchen, reaching automatically for 2 cups instead of 1. Hearing a story on the news and turning to comment, then remembering there was no one there to hear it. Those were small things, the kind you would never write down. But they stacked, and eventually, they weighed more than I expected. I realized that for years, my sense of value had been tied to usefulness. If something needed fixing, I mattered. If something needed paying for, I mattered. That logic had worked for most of my life. But when there was nothing urgent left to manage, I felt strangely invisible. Not ignored, just unnecessary. People checked in on me after my wife died. They asked how I was holding up. I gave them the answer I'd practiced my whole life. I'm managing. Managing had always been enough before. It had always ended the conversation. What I didn't know how to say was that managing doesn't fill the hours. It doesn't answer the quiet questions. It doesn't tell you who you are when no one needs you to carry anything anymore. When the weight finally comes off and you realize how much of yourself was wrapped up in holding it, I started replaying moments I had never thought much about. Not arguments, not mistakes you could point to, just pauses. Times when she waited for me to ask something and I didn't. Times when she shared something fragile and I responded with something practical. At the time, those moments felt neutral, almost forgettable. Now they felt loaded, heavy in a way they never had before. I used to believe love was proven through consistency, through reliability, through not leaving. I see now that love also asks to be witnessed, to be met while it's happening, not later, when things slow down. There were things my wife carried alone while I was standing right next to her. Not because I didn't care, because I didn't know how to enter a space without a task. I didn't know how to be there without doing something, without earning my place. That's a hard thing to admit at 80. I don't feel guilt in the sharp sense. I feel understanding without repair. That's a particular kind of pain. You finally see the shape of the truth, but there's no place left to bring it. No one left to hand it to. I think about how often I mistook silence for peace. How often I believed that not arguing meant we were aligned. We weren't arguing because we weren't always meeting in the same place. We were orbiting the same life from different distances. I had built a life around holding things together. I hadn't built one around opening things up. After she was gone, people praised me for how strong I was, for how well I had taken care of everything. No one asked what I had never learned to say, and I didn't volunteer it. That's another habit that doesn't disappear easily. You don't suddenly become expressive at 80. There's a loneliness that comes from loss, and then there's a loneliness that comes from realization. They're not the same. The first is about absence. The second is about missed presence. The second one stays quieter and longer. I realized that my children knew me as reliable, but not always reachable. They respected me. They trusted me. But there were parts of themselves they didn't bring to me. Parts that needed curiosity more than solutions. Not because I was harsh, because I was closed in ways I didn't recognize. Providing had been my shield, and shields block both directions. They protect you, but they also keep you from being touched. At this age, there are no grand corrections, no dramatic confessions that change the past. There's only naming what I did well, and naming what I never learned in time. I don't regret working hard. I don't regret taking responsibility seriously. But I do regret believing that effort could replace emotional presence, that endurance could stand in for intimacy. I regret thinking that love could be deferred until things were easier. Things never really got easier. They just got quieter. If there's anything left for me now, It's this clarity. Being needed is not the same as being known. Being dependable is not the same as being available. And love doesn't keep score the way we think it does. You don't earn it by carrying everything alone. You share it by letting yourself be seen carrying it. I can't give that lesson back to my wife. That time is gone. But I can hold it honestly now, without excuses, without pretending I didn't know better. And maybe, if you're listening, you'll recognize something here before it hardens into habit. Not to fix, not to provide, just to stay present while there's still someone there to notice.